So welcome to this webinar on measuring circularity and putting circularity metrics to work in business. We have a great session planned for you, and we're very excited that this is an official side event of the World Circular Economy Forum. And we are happy to put on this from RISE today, from the Sustainable Business Unit. So what's going to happen today is I will briefly introduce RISE and our work before handing it over to my colleagues for a brief presentation and, of course, a discussion where we would like to hear from you and take your questions. My name is Katherine Whalen, and I'm a researcher here at RISE in sustainable business, and as part of my managing partner at the Nordic Circular Hotspot. So at the Nordic Circular Hotspot, we're working as a consortium of Nordic partners working to facilitate knowledge sharing and matchmaking among different Nordic partners and within and across Nordic countries. And I'm also the host of the Getting in the Loop podcast, which is a podcast about circular economy. RISE, or RISE, which stands for the Research Institutes of Sweden, is the Swedish Research Institute and innovation partner for every part of society. So while our broad business affects all of the UN sustainability goals, you can see here, as indicated by the size on screen, that we focus on and make some main contributions in terms of some more than others. Today's webinar is hosted by RISE Sustainable Business, which is just one unit as part of the larger RISE organization. And at Sustainable Business, we aim to combine scientific standards and a drive to transform industry towards sustainable society. And to do that, we work with both the public and the private sector. Circular economy is one of our main focus areas. And as part of this, we conduct actionable research on a wide range of circular economy areas, including design and procurement, business coaching, and of course, metrics, which is the focus of today's webinar. So in our work with metrics, we have investigated measuring circular economy in work with companies and helping them on their circular economy journey. And you will hear about that later in just a moment from my colleagues. And I'd like to recognize that this research and this webinar is made possible by the Marianne and Marcus Wallenberg Foundation, as well as the Swedish Innovation Agency, or Vinnova. So measuring circular business models and CRINC, which stands for Circularity Metrics and Business KPIs, are just two research projects that we have worked on in regards to metrics and some of the results we will be sharing today. We also recognize that with a circular economy, it's about systemic transformation. So it's not just about business. And we also, of course, work then with the public sector. So one of the projects that we have been doing is called Proceed, which is about public procurement. And we have also taken the lead of an expert group who has worked during the past year to develop recommendations regarding circularity measurements to the Swedish Circular Economy Delegation. So the recommendations have included both for the development of indicators and statistics on a national level within Sweden, but also for measures of product level circularity. And you will hear some about these metrics from my colleagues. And at this point, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Robert Boyer, to give you a bit of information regarding measuring circularity in businesses. So Robbie, please introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Robert Boyer. I'm in Gothenburg, Sweden right now. I'm a senior researcher in sustainable business at RISE. And thank you, Katherine, for introducing RISE so well. My background is in urban planning, and I actually worked as a professor of geography and urban sustainability before moving to Sweden and transitioning to working with the circular economy and mobility as a service, primarily in Sweden, but as Katherine mentioned, we work on all sorts of international projects. I'm very interested in interdisciplinary approaches to sustainability and practical ways to initiate and to contribute to transitions, systemic transitions in society. And so I've had a lot of fun exploring how the circular economy can apply in different places, and then some of the challenges that companies in particular encounter as they are trying to measure circularity within their own operations. So let's move forward to the next slide. And so I want to begin this presentation by discussing the proliferation of circular economy assessment tools out there. There are, by my last count, over 150 different published metrics that businesses or different types of organizations can use to measure circularity as part of the circular economy. As I was watching people enter into this webinar, I saw that Michael Saidani signed on. Hello, Dr. Saidani. His work is cited right here, and he and his colleagues have put together a really good Excel spreadsheet showing all of, up until I think it was 2018, all sorts of circularity metrics that exist, and they've created a tool that can help you identify what metrics work well for you. Another person I saw sign on to this webinar was Eric Roos Lindegren, who recently, he and colleagues published a paper discussing all the different circularity metrics that are out there. And so with this proliferation, there are, first of all, that's a really good sign that the circular economy is expanding and that there are lots of tools for businesses to measure circularity. It's also, it shows that there's a huge diversity of contexts in which circularity is being measured. So those are good things. On the other hand, if you are working for a business, or if you're working for, let's say, a school or a nonprofit organization or a local government, and you're interested in measuring circularity, you might be overwhelmed with the amount of tools out there. And as we at RISE have observed our different project partners and clients measuring circularity, we've come across a couple of standard dilemmas that that organizations face as they're deciding, how do I even begin to measure circularity? And so we label these the 3 S's, right? The 3 dilemmas of measuring circularity. And if you're out there listening and you're trying to figure out, how do I even start? I anticipate that some of these might apply to you. So they are called, we call them the scale dilemma, the specificity dilemma, and the subjectivity dilemma. And I'll go over all of these very quickly, starting with the scale dilemma. The scale dilemma is basically that certain metrics are really good at measuring very small things, and certain metrics are good at measuring very big things, and some metrics are good at measuring everything in between. And so this dilemma is, if you've chosen a metric, is that metric good at measuring the thing at the scale that you need it to measure? So can the metric you've chosen, if it's meant to measure the circularity of the nail in a table that you're building, is that metric also good for measuring the circularity of the entire table? Or how about all the furniture in the building? Or how about all the buildings in a city or an entire nation? And so again, the dilemma is that some metrics are designed for very small scale applications. Some are designed for very big scale applications. And then the ones that are designed for everything in between, some things might fall from the cracks. So that's one dilemma that you might encounter. Moving forward, another dilemma is what we call the specificity dilemma. We could as well call this the sector dilemma, which is that there are some metrics that are very well tailored for certain industries and certain very specific applications. So there is a metric that is designed specifically for the Chinese steel industry. And that is not going to be very useful if you are trying to measure the circularity of public procurement or a couch or a mobile phone. And so there are trade-offs, right? Maybe a tool that is designed for your industry is not going to be good for things if you just step outside that boundary. Or on the other hand, a metric that is designed to measure everything and anything might not be very good at capturing the intricacies of circularity of the very specific thing that you want to measure. So that's the dilemma. On one hand, we can have a very specific metric. On the other hand, we can have a very general metric and everything in between. So how do you pick the right one? And then finally, the subjectivity dilemma, which is, I'm guessing, the most common dilemma that, that businesses and other organizations are encountering, is that some metrics have very objective criteria. And this is a good thing, right? Especially to us academics. We want to make sure that a metric, if you apply it, if one person applies it, that another person who applies it will get the same exact results. So that's very important. On the other hand, the most objective, right, the most valid and reliable metrics are often, we've found, the most difficult to apply. Sometimes it's a matter of finding the data. Sometimes the data that you need is proprietary, and it's very difficult to work across organizations to find that data. Sometimes it takes a long time, or it takes very complex math to apply that. And if you are a small startup with a small number of people, maybe you don't have the skill set or the time to apply the metric correctly. And so there are, of course, trade-offs, right? And the big question is, can a circularity metric be both objective and practical to use? So that's of course, the biggest challenge that we've encountered. Next slide.
Thank you, Robert. We'd like to just take a brief pause from the presentation and hear from you. So I'd like to ask you, I see a lot of you already introducing yourselves and sharing experiences that you've had with metrics and why you are actually interested in metrics. I'd like to ask you to reflect on which metrics you are currently using. So feel free to share in the chat. Maybe you've used some of the ones that Robert has listed. So list your favorite circularity metrics and maybe what you like about it or some experience you've had with it. And if you already have a question for the team, there will be, of course, the panel discussion and Q&A from the audience after Robert's presentation. So feel free, of course, to already begin writing in the chat and just asking questions. So share some favorite circularity metrics, or if you already have a question for the team. Back to you, Robert.
Okay. As I mentioned before, there are some metrics have some subjectivity in them. This is not to say that they're a bad metric or an unreliable metric. In fact, some of the most useful assessment tools are tools that you can use for free online, but the trade-off is that the questions might not be objective, right? So it might ask, are you using renewable materials? Yes or no, or yes, sometimes and maybe. And these tools tend to be kind of rough sketches, right, to get you moving in the right direction. So it's very important that if you're using a subjective tool or tools that rely on subjective assessment questions, that you understand that this is probably not meant to measure the exact level of circularity, but to help you move in the right direction or identify gaps in what you're doing. And so on the other hand, a very objective metric, or the most objective metrics that we've worked with, tend to be very, very demanding to use. And you can't do it. Usually you can't apply these just sitting down at your desk in a day. It can often take the help of consultants or the help of other researchers or other experts to apply it correctly. Particularly if you're applying life cycle assessment, right? I saw one person in the chat said that they use LCA, and as we'll get to in a second, LCA is an important way to validate measures of circularity, but it's applying LCA correctly is not something that a layperson or a startup owner can necessarily do. And so if we move to the next slide, I think we have a quick schematic of how of a general trend that we see. Actually, if we can go back one slide. Yes, a general trend that we see with circularity metrics is that the more objective they get, oftentimes the more demanding they become. That's not to say that any are better or worse, but it's something to keep in mind. as you're choosing a metric to use. Of course, the goal is to land in that southeast quadrant, right? Find a metric that is both objective and simple. This is the $1 million question. Can we develop this? I'd like to think that we're getting closer. But until we find that perfect balance of objectivity and abundant free data and simplicity, we want to suggest, and this is something that we've been working on at Rise Sustainable Business for the past year or so, that you handle these types of problems pragmatically. And for that, we've come up with a heuristic, kind of a mental guide called the 3 dimensions of product circularity. And this is something that we've introduced in a working paper. We currently have an academic paper under review that really goes into detail about the 3 dimensions of circularity. But we call these 3 dimensions recirculation, utilization, and endurance. These should look familiar, right? These, especially for those of you that have, for example, used the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's Material Circulation Index. These types of variables, these types of dimensions should not be a surprise, but they are different ways of representing strategies for achieving circularity. None of them are more important than the other, and our recommendation is that you explore metrics that get at these different dimensions in a practical way. So let's briefly go over them. So recirculation is an approximation, right? It's a measurement of how much of a product's material comes from a prior, a recirculated path, right? Some prior use, and returns to another use phase. So recirculation is probably what most people think of when they think of the circular economy, right? Recycling, for example, is a way of achieving higher recirculation, or reusing a product, or refurbishing a product. These are all ways of achieving higher recirculation. So this should probably come as no surprise. Many of the metrics out there are mostly focused on recirculation. And in a minute, I'm going to go over one of the metrics that our colleagues at Rise have developed that is exclusively focused on recirculation. And we've validated it in a few tests. Another dimension of circularity is utilization, which is measures or approximates how much or how often a product is being used in its functional lifespan. Utilization, right? Poor utilization, rather a good example of poor utilization would be a car that sits in a parking lot, right? If a car just sits around, as most of them do, for, I don't know, over 90% of its functional lifespan, it would have low utilization. However, if you have a different business model, right, like car sharing or even a taxi business model, that car is in constant use. And so we want to reward constant use of resources rather than resources that sit idle and rust or go out of style, right? That is, by in our opinion, a poor use of resources. And then the third dimension that we'll talk about is endurance, which is basically another word for longevity or durability. Even though we think that there are nuances between these different terms, those nuances are pretty academic, so we won't go into it now. But basically, we want to determine how well does a product retain its value. If a product is physically durable, is able to withstand changes in style, in taste, and in technological change, then you have a product with very high endurance. Some strategies for increasing endurance would be modularity or adaptable design. And we have colleagues at Rise that are specifically focused on adaptive design and future adaptability, which is anticipating change that we don't even know exists. And there are lots of very cool design strategies for that that we would have to save a whole seminar for. Okay, so those are the 3 dimensions of circularity. So let's move forward. One way of really understanding how these 3 dimensions of circularity work is to imagine a product with two of the dimensions, but not the other one, right? So this illustration that you see on the screen, the red represents that dimension being completely ignored, whereas the green means that those dimensions are optimized. So if you have a product that has high utilization, high endurance, but no material recirculation, you have a product that is used often, it's very durable, but it's made mostly of virgin material, right? So so think of a well-used tool that is made of virgin steel. You can think about how in some ways that is circular, but mostly it's a linear product because it's made of virgin stuff. What if, so if we move forward, we can imagine a product with high material recirculation, high endurance, but low utilization, right? So maybe you have a product that is refabricated from a prior use. It is highly durable, it is modular, it never goes out of style, but it sits in storage all day. There's no one using it. And we would argue that this is also an example of low circularity, or we certainly see how the circularity of that product can be improved. And if you're working with improving utilization, this dimension, almost always it's going to be changes in the business model, right? The physical design of a product, it could probably influence its utilization, but we're very focused here on RISE at how can we encourage business models that encourage constant use of products rather than idle storage or disposal. And then finally, if we move forward to a product that has very high material recirculation and high utilization, but low endurance, you could imagine a product that is made of recycled material. It is constantly in use, but the second you buy it, or the second you open up the package, it breaks. Or the second you open up the package, a new model comes out, and that old model is completely incompatible with the features of the new model. So that is arguably, again, not a very circular product because it loses its value immediately. So this is how we like to think about three dimensions and understanding them by imagining what it would look like if one of the dimensions were completely ignored. Let's move forward. So, that heuristic is something that we are applying across our different project partners, across our clients, and the way that we use that heuristic is that we help our clients solve their problems where they're sitting, right? So if our clients have a certain capacity to use certain types of metrics and not others, we help them pick out metrics that work for their particular product and for their particular capacity to apply those metrics. I want to spend the next few minutes talking about one of the metrics that we have used at RISE over the past few years to measure material recirculation, right? So this is one of the dimensions of the circular economy. It was developed by my colleagues Marcus Linder, Stephen Saracini, and Patricia Van Loon, and published in a paper in the Journal of Industrial Ecology in 2017. I'll show you a screenshot of that paper in a second. And we have since validated this metric with a couple of tests, which I'll talk about in a second. But the C metric is basically a ratio. And in some ways, this is a very simple, conceptually very simple way of measuring circularity, which is you take a product and you take the economic value of all the recirculated content of that product divided by the entire economic value of that content, of that product. So if you have a product and 50% of the value of that product is made of recycled stuff or reused or recirculated stuff, then the C value would be 0.5. And there are some really good reasons that we, at least from our perspective, to use economic value. First of all, it's scalable, right? So remember, I was talking before about the scale dilemma. One of the issues of using other dimensions is that using mass, for example, as a way of instead of economic value, right? So if we were using the weight or the mass of your product that is recirculated divided by the entire product, it might be hard, right, to measure mass at enormous scales, or to reconcile the density or the type of material that is being weighed. So economic value is something that works across lots of different scales. When you add $1 here, it's the same as $1 somewhere else. This has been, right, and as I'll go into a little bit later, it's really easy to scale up this metric from a very small component to a large, at least theoretically, it's easy to scale it up from a small component to a complex of components, to an entire room, to maybe even a whole nation. Theoretically easy, practically maybe not so much. There are some other good reasons that the C metric is it is also objective, I should say, right? So if we can determine the value of a product or a component of a product, it's very easy to objectively assess this. There's a very simple equation, and you can objectively assess and assign a score of the circularity of a product. There are some challenges to this, and we'll get to that in a second. Let's move forward. As I was talking about before, it's relatively easy to scale up this metric, and the way that we do it is we create a product tree. So imagine a product that is made of 5 different parts, and those parts are components in subcomponents, and ultimately a product. Basically, if we know the extent to which each of those product components is made of recirculated material, we can, using data about the value of those products and the extent to which it is recirculated, determine the entire C value. And we've done that. Next slide. We've done that on a test of 20 different clients from mostly Swedish clients. And what we did in a paper, in that paper that you see on the right, published earlier this year, is we calculated the C value for a whole range of products, right? Very simple up until some very complex products. And we also worked with some colleagues to determine to basically run an LCA analysis. So we were able to determine the global warming potential, for example, of each of these products. And we found that there was an inverse correlation, right? A negative relationship between a product's C score and its impact on the environment, which is what we were hoping to see. And so what we have found is that there is a strong association, at least in our limited validation test. There's a strong association between a product's material recirculation and its impact on the environment. And so for those of you that are geeks about circularity metrics, what this does for us is it basically liberates us from including environmental impact as part of our metric. And instead, we know, or we have a lot of evidence to show, that our economic-based circularity metric correlates with impacts on the environment. So there are lots of implications for this. We can save them for another time. But for those of you that were worried that maybe an economic an economic-based metric maybe had nothing to do with the environment, our studies have shown, in fact, it does. So that gave us a lot of confidence. And so you can read about both of these in their respective journals. Let's move forward. So the C metric, again, it partially resolves the scale dilemma by using the economic value that can be summed and valued for an entire product. Maybe one day this could be scaled up to an entire macro economy. If there are any regional economists out there that want to experiment with applying this, get in contact with us. It partially resolves the specificity dilemma. That's another advantage I neglected to mention, is that this can apply to any context, right? Basically any field that has values, that has cost data. There are some challenges with operationalizing economic value. But basically, the short answer with how you determine the economic value is basically the cost to the supplier. So where we've found this is a challenge is when we're working with outfitters, right? Basically companies that are dealing with lots of different suppliers, sometimes tracking down the value of every single micro component can take a whole lot of time. And for these clients, we've developed alternatives to the C metric, which we can talk about later. Again, so it applies to almost any context, and it partially resolves the subjectivity dilemma because it eliminates value judgments, right? I can be objective about the value of a product so long as I can find that data. And so to the extent that I can find cost data about every component of a product, I can apply the C metric. As you can all probably imagine, if I was applying this to a bus, right, with millions of components, it might take me, it might take more time than I have on Earth to actually calculate the C metric. And so we're hoping that perhaps with machine learning or enhanced computing power, we might be able to apply this on a grander scale. But for now, we have not done that. And then finally, the last caveat that I would offer about the C metric is that it focuses on only one dimension of circularity. It doesn't focus on utilization or endurance. So if you are achieving circularity through a product service system, by lending out, by leasing out a product and repairing that product and increasing the lifespan of that product, you are not being rewarded by the C metric. And so that's the main reason we decided to expand our analysis to these three dimensions, because we wanted to make sure that companies that were achieving circularity through different avenues were being rewarded for that. And the C metric doesn't do that. Okay, moving forward.
Yes, thank you so much for that overview, Robert. I would like to now take the time to have our panelists introduce themselves. So my colleagues from Sustainable Business. Agnieszka, would you unmute yourself and give a brief introduction to everyone?
Hello, my name is Agnieszka Hunka. At RISE, I work in the team Sustainable Business on everything related to consumers. So issues such as willingness to pay for circular products and market demand for circular products. My background is in psychology and environmental science, actually, and before coming to RISE, I was a professor in environmental science. So I've spent quite a long time in academia before moving to 100% research here at RISE.
Thank you, Agnieszka. And Emanuela.
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Emanuela Vanacore, and I work as a researcher at RISE in the same team, Sustainable Business, based in Gothenburg, Sweden. My background is in management, environmental management, and economics. Before joining RISE 3.5 years ago, I actually worked as a business coach consultant, especially with clean tech companies. Now I focus my research on circular economy and some enablers aspects such as business model innovation, management systems, public procurement. And in my work, I focused at both the firm level and the ecosystem level. Thank you.
Excellent. And you have heard from Robert as well, so we won't need an introduction from Robert. He's given a great overview of measuring circularity in business and the work that we are doing currently at RISE. So what I would like to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment, and we're going to have a bit of a Q&A with Agnieszka, Emanuela, and of course, Robert. And one of the first things that I wanted to do was to share the results of the poll, so you got a chance to see kind of who is also out here in this webinar. So from what I see, it seems that we have a fair amount of people attending this webinar from consulting as well as from academia and maybe also research like ourselves. We also have a significant amount of others. So maybe if you're part of that other category, if you introduce yourself and tell us why you selected other, then that will help us for future as well, for making the categories in the future. And we have a bit of a clear, but 33% of you say that there are too many metrics to choose from. Which one is right for me? So that maybe gives our panel a bit of a challenge today. So feel free, of course, to ask questions in the chat box about your situation, and we'd love to see how we can help you out. And we also have 30% of people say, help, I don't even know where to start. So it seems that this is a very pressing topic for people. And before I would like to ask the panelists some questions, and of course also look in the chat box for your questions, but I wanted to just give also a bit of a summary of some of the metrics that I've been seeing people say that they've used, or their favorite metrics. So we had LCA pop up, as Robert has mentioned before in his presentation. We also, of course, have the EMF MCI metric, and we have one of the developers of that metric, James Godden, on this webinar today as well. So nice to have you here, James. And I saw something that I'm not as familiar with, but I'm going to definitely check out after this session, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I know of them, but they have apparently a circular transition indicator. So that's something, and I see you shaking your head, Emanuela, so maybe you're familiar with that. So I wanted to ask, actually, Agnieszka, one of the things that I saw coming through the chat was someone said in their experience, the motivation depends on the why, in terms of why a company or a community would want to measure circularity. And so why might a company be interested in measuring circularity?
There are several reasons, I think. And from my perspective, the important reason is because they can sell their products as circular and actually show with a label or some kind of indicator how their product compares to other products in terms of circularity. So a metric is used as a benchmark in this case. And actually we conducted recently, the results are just out and published or in press, a really exciting study where we looked at willingness to pay and market interest and market demand for circular products, where we actually used C metric as basically one of the features of the products that we compare. So the description that is close to the C metric, because it was the percent of or ratio of the recirculated or reused parts in a product, was used as one of the attributes in our study. It was a classic choice experiment, so people were given a selection of products to choose from, and we had 800 respondents in total, choosing different products. We had two categories of electronic goods. One was a mobile phone, and the other one was a robot vacuum cleaner. So quite close in terms of that they both have batteries and are in the same category of like household or personal electronics. but also they are quite far. And actually, we were able to demonstrate that a circular product up to 50% of recirculated content performs very well in comparison to what is currently available on the market. We ran several market simulations and model demand curves for these products. So I would simply say that there is, for companies, there is a lot of uncertainty around moving into a circular business model. There are fears about cannibalization of their existing product lines, and the fear if the recirculated product would sell at all. So our study shows that yes, first of all, there is a risk of cannibalization because the circular products performed so well. But on the other hand, there is interest and there is market demand for product clearly labeled as circular. And I would say that circularity metrics in future can probably serve the same way as organic product certificates have now. Yeah, does it answer your question?
Yes, I think so. It also makes me think of the case. I hear you say that there could be maybe a financial incentive for companies to do this, which makes me also think about, you know, we've seen similar things with environmental labels and things like that, where there's not a lot of, maybe it's questionable about the credibility that backs it up in terms of who's actually the organization that is saying this is circular or this is not circular. I see there is I think that there is a need for standardization, but I'm going to ask Emanuela sort of, what do you think in terms of a need for standardization in terms of circular economy metrics, and do you see a specific area that is highest priority for that?
I mean, many thanks for this interesting question, Katherine, because I think in short, the short answer is yes. I think standardization is very, very important. I mean, standards in general, you know, they play a key role in the economy. They are pretty much everywhere, as they provide, you know, people, organizations with you know, a basis for a mutual understanding, and they're used as a tool to facilitate communication, measurement, trades, manufacturing. So specifically, they facilitate business interaction. They support and enable companies to comply with you know, relevant laws and regulation. In some cases, they speed up the introduction of innovative products to market. I would say that also they increase the interoperability between new and existing products, services, and processes. But they also, I think, they help disseminate knowledge in industries where, you know, there is a need for interaction between products and processes that are supplied by various you know, providers. And in reality, it can be observed that when standards are established, industry, you know, the industry takes more you know, risk to invest, because there is a way to you know, measures, for instance, the market. And I would also add that, you know, let's remind ourselves that standardization typically stems from, you know, voluntary cooperation between different interested parties, consumers, industries, public authorities, researchers, for instance, and any other party who's interested in developing some technical specifications. But obviously, it's important to reach consensus. That's why we can call you know, some tools like standards. And another point I think that is worth reflecting upon is that historically governments have have played a very, very important role in establishing measures. For example, if we think about measuring distance in the meter system, it was developed in France during the Age of Enlightenment and then spread out across Europe. And for instance, if we take one single country as an example, Sweden, it was the parliament who actually ratified and adopted that system, the meter system, and that obviously solved a lot of problems in terms of harmonizing the different ways to measure distance in the country. So that facilitated trades internally, but also at the European and international level. And what's interesting, I think, is also noting that standardization has been identified in the European Horizon 2020 program as one of the innovation support measures that can help bridge the gap between research and the market. And now if we focus obviously on measuring circularity and standards, it's clear because of obviously there's no consensus still, it's a work in progress on measuring circularity. There is a lack of agreement on what could be like an objective way to measure circularity. But you know, many organizations are playing their part in some of the aspects of circularity, like recycling or resourcing or sourcing locally at a very individual level. But what we need also to kind of agree on is a shared, global vision of what circular economy is, and obviously how to measure it. There is an attempt, or a very first example of how to standardize circularity, and that is the British standard 8001 that was issued in 2017. Is a framework for implementing the principles of the circular economy in organizations. It comes in the forms of guidelines, so it's not a certifiable standard, but still I would recommend you to have a look at the guidelines. And to finish off, I would say that ISO, the International Standard Organizations, has actually recognized the importance of standardizing circular economy, and there is currently a technical committee, ISO TC 323, that is currently working on that, and I think the committee is made of around 60-65 different countries. I know that we have a representative here from the UK, but we also have a representative, a colleague from RISE who sits in the Swedish Technical Committee, and the committee basically intends to come up with a set of internationally agreed principles, terminology, a framework in general on what circular economy is, and obviously they want to develop management standards and metrics for circular economy. And I think what would be perhaps good is, like, there is an opportunity to collaborate on those technical committees because they're open to anybody who has an interest. So I would strongly recommend to try to get in touch and support such an important work. So there is I would say an urgency to do so. So I hope that answer.
Yes, thank you, Emanuela, for that overview. I was noticing that many people were commenting in the chat, like ISO standard in development right now. So we have a bit of a chat going on. So great that you touched on that, and thank you for the overview. I wanted to ask Robert, about, we have a question in terms of how is a circular product defined? Does the product have to comply with the 3 dimensions of circularity, so recirculation, endurance, and utilization, or is one enough? And that's from Maria, I believe.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's 2 questions, right? First, how is a circular product defined? This is a contested thing, right? It is humans made up this category of circularity. It's something that there are multiple academic papers arguing about what is the definition of a circular product. And I think that the fact that we have chosen 3 dimensions is a sign of the complexity of this concept. I'm sure that there are other dimensions that could be, added to the triangle, or added to the polygon to describe what circularity is. But we think that this is very practical. So we have at RISE, we throw around different definitions, but a circular product is something that retains its value forever and ever and ever, right? So it's about as possible as sustainability, right? It's really a theoretical idea. It's not something that, it's probably not something that is true empirically. All things will eventually, disintegrate, and nothing is actually going to last forever and ever. But we can do our best to retain the value of products, and the value of a product is the consequence of lots of different things, right? So a physical product may retain its physical form, but completely lose its value. So it's also a product's value is the consequence of lots of things outside of that product, right? The society at large, or government regulations, or supply and demand. So there's no real way, right? No natural way to measure or define a circular product. So that's a very long-winded answer to your first question. The second question is, does a product, or does something need to satisfy all 3 dimensions of the 3 dimensions of circularity? And the answer is no. And in fact, there are some times when, at least practically, these things might trade off, right? So you might create a very, very durable product, and that might require virgin materials, right? When recycled materials might not be as durable. But the reason that we're also interested in utilization is that if you increase the utilization of that product, then there will be less material flowing through the economy ultimately, right? So if you have a product that lasts a very long time, it is constantly used, and there's a system that keeps that product in use, then down the line, there's going to be one less of that product produced in a factory, and hopefully one less product disposed of in an incinerator or in a landfill. And so my operational definition of a circular economy is an economy where there is no extraction of virgin materials and no waste produced, right? And so to the extent that a product can satisfy those things, I think we can achieve a circular product, but we can do that through lots of different avenues. I think ideally, yes, we do satisfy all 3 of those things, but that doesn't mean, so I should clarify, just because we want to satisfy all 3 of those things doesn't mean that you have to, at the same time, use all 3 strategies, because it's just beyond the practical limitations of most companies. So our recommendation is that you work with the capacity you have to improve the dimension that is most accessible to you. And then down the line, you can pick the suppliers. So for example, if you're a service provider, you can work on providing a service that that keeps materials in circulation, right, through repair, through maintenance, and then you can outsource the actual production to companies that you know use recycled or reused materials. But the first step needs to be one of these three dimensions. So short answer, ideally all three, but necessary, not at first.
Thank you, Robert. I just saw in the chat that Maria, who asked this question, I think she was interested in also the consumer study that Agnieszka was conducting. And so I'm wondering, maybe you can clarify for Maria, Agnieszka, how the circular product was defined when doing the testing.
So as I said, it was a classic choice experiment. In a choice experiment, a product is defined by its attributes at different levels. And we had attributes such as price. Of course, if you want to calculate willingness to pay, you need to have a price. Battery life, warranty, customer service, types of sellers, and appearance, and of course circularity. And circularity was defined as a percent of reused, remanufactured, or refurbished content in a product. And there were, the levels were 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. And then it was explained that basically the whole product is reused in the entirety. So this was something new, obviously, to the respondents. Well, not completely new, because there's like a thriving market, for instance, for reused mobile phones, and there are already examples of products like this on the market, and sellers that, for instance, refurbish only a part, like replace a battery, and the rest of the phone is sold on. So you can argue that this is probably a product that would be 75% circular because the battery is brand new. And this was grasped really well by the respondents, but they were introduced to circular economy. It was a shopping scenario, basically, like imagine that you are going to buy a mobile phone and then you enter a shop where there's an extra information and you can choose something that contained reused content, and this kind of information is displayed next to each product. There's the other attributes. There's a lot of studies that show that basically when people buy used or secondhand, that they are concerned about appearance, and that they are also concerned, obviously, when buying mobile phones, with battery life, and they're concerned about like the usability, or they don't trust that a used thing would work. So this was something that we also looked at. We looked basically at attributes that are external to things like brand, but can increase a trust in the circular offer. So something that the circular firm could basically add on to their reused offering to increase trust, such as basically offer extra warranty. And businesses like that are already on the market. There are examples of thriving businesses selling like mobile phones or photo equipment and things like that. Does it answer your question?
I think so. I think that's a good overview, Agnieszka. And there were some more questions about that. So I think, but I think you touched on that in your response. So, and I would direct people to the paper as well if they're interested in learning more. Robbie shared it in the chat. The chat is going a mile a minute, so maybe scroll up, or we'll send it again in the chat shortly. there has been, I've been looking in the chat, there's a lot of discussions about market value and some interesting conversations that are happening in regards to that. And I wanted to direct that to you, Robert. If one of the questions that I saw, and this was many chats ago, it was about, I think it came from James Godden, about using value as a measure of circulation and raising the question of how to assess economic value of increasing the circularity of a product. So that's kind of the main question focus. And there was also aspects of what degree do you account for additional costs in regards to like reverse logistics, storage. Yeah. So maybe you want to take that, Robert.
Good question. Yeah. So I'll address the first one kind of globally. There are very valid critiques to using economic value as a measure for the material content of a product. I think Dr. Goddard is probably bringing up some very valid critiques, which is that the economic value of something is the product of all sorts of social factors. So for example, tariffs, right? Or international conflict. That can vary from place to place and affect the price of different components from country to country. And so in that sense, we have to be very forthcoming about the use of this metric, is that where you calculate the value, where that value is calculated can have an effect on the relative circularity of a component, right? So if the price of a certain mineral is very high in country A, the way that is factored into the C metric, if it is calculated in country A, is going to look different than in country B. I think that's a fair critique, and I think that that's something that one challenge with this objective metric is that there is no perfect way, unless we can count atoms, which we can't do, to actually in a perfectly objective way account for all the material of a product. In the same way, there are issues of using other measurable features of a product, right? If we, as I mentioned before, if we were to use weight, there are certain very lightweight things that are very critical to the operation, or that really change the characteristic of a product, that if we were to only account for weight, it might not do justice to how rare or how challenging it is, or society's evaluation of that thing. So there are trade-offs, I think, to using any kind of objective criteria, whether it be weight, whether it be economic value. So I think that's fair. I think it's a fair critique. I saw that there was some banter back and forth about how rare something is, and I think that's true, right? So if something is very rare yet very cheap, yes, this metric doesn't completely account for how circular that is, and that's one shortcoming of this metric, is that in our attempt to be very objective, we can't do everything. The second part of that question, if I recall, is how do we account for value added, right? So there are lots of things that go into the calculation of the value of a component that isn't the physical part of that component, right? So there is the price of all the physical components, but there's also the value of maintenance, and the value of, as one person said, reverse logistics, right? That costs something. And if you remember that product tree, the product tree calculates the value of something and then its level of circularity at each level. And if you read the Linder article, the Linder et al. Article from 2017, one of the steps in calculating the value of a component is to integrate the value added from the lower level, right? So if you spend resources in maintaining or sending something back and forth, that gets integrated into the value of a component. So that's I think that's the answer. I think if I understand the question correct, that's how that's handled within the C metric.
Thank you for that explanation, Robert. There's a couple more questions about the C metric in the chat, but before we get to those, I wanted to direct a question I saw from Victor to Emanuela, which is about, have you seen specific success factors for companies that want to transform towards a circular business model? And I think that fits quite well as well with metrics and measuring circularity, because yeah, are there specific indicators that or success factors that you're seeing? So Victor goes on to say, do companies like Houdini, who do it all at once, or are there sort of companies that separate new business units from more traditional business units? So again, yeah, what kind of, have you seen success factors for companies who want to be adopting?
Yes, thanks for the questions. Yeah, finding the right business model is like finding the magic, a little bit like a magic formula, and because there's different elements to get right and to balance. I would say that based on the experience and what we've observed with the companies that we've been working on, I would say that one critical factor for a business model, like circular business model, to succeed is the need for a strong leadership. So especially, it depends obviously on the size of the business, but I would say a key factor is like a strong leadership has to be like has to drive the change, the transformation, and there is a need obviously of that this there is a shared also agreement, understanding of where between the different people in a company on where the company wants to go. I would say that companies that are successful are like in such a transformation, companies who can really create a very nice consistent flow between the company strategy, the objectives that are set to match that strategy, the following KPIs, and the metrics. So when this flow is nice, consistent, then the companies stand a higher chance to succeed. But there is also, I think, another element that is very important to consider, and that is being aware and being open to take a conversation with both the supply chain and the customers, because it's only by sharing the knowledge, the vision, getting feedback and inputs that we can actually create that change at both the firm level but also at the ecosystem, let's say, level.
Thank you, Emanuela. I'm conscious of the time and that we're getting to sort of the wrapping down part of the webinar. But before we start to wrap up, maybe we can do a couple quick rounds of questions to the panelists. So there are some questions that I had captured from earlier in the chat, and one of them was about, do you know of a circularity metric that incorporates reverse logistics? I think you touched on this, Robert, before a little bit in your discussion, but maybe do you know of another circularity metric, maybe specifically for reverse logistics? Not offhand. Nope. Okay. This is a quick round. So then another question.
But that does not mean that there isn't such a metric. I would be surprised if there wasn't, but not right away. Can't think of any.
Yeah. Thank you. And then does C-metric work when we want to compare two different material bio-based product with PET? So if you have two different types of material, does that take that into account? So the example is bio-based product versus PET. product. And if there's any of you who really want to jump on this question, then I'll open it up for whoever, Robert, Agnieszka, Emanuela. Robert?
Yeah, no, we have not applied this to bio-based materials with one exception. There was one product in our study that I published a link to that was basically a leather product. And I believe that unfortunately, we had to count that as completely 0% circular. And so to the extent that bio-based products are one and done, the C metric doesn't necessarily reward things that are virgin and then are immediately discarded. But so we don't have a lot of experience measuring bio-based products is the short answer. But so it might take a little more work and a little more theorizing before we're confident saying that it works well with them.
Thank you. And there was a question recently from Julian about international rankings of companies or businesses by level of circularity. And I think this is an interesting question. And I'm curious from our panelists what you would respond to this. So Emanuela, off the top of your head, do you know of international rankings of companies or businesses by level of circularity?
Not on top of my head, but
maybe someone in the chat wants to help.
Maybe that could be really, really interesting, because there's what is obviously probably all of you know that there are so many platforms and circular economy. But I know that one thing maybe I can think of is that on the European Commission, website, there's quite a lot about circular economy, and there are best cases, and there are all sort of they typically do all sort of rankings. So maybe it would be good to take a look at that. So, for instance, I know that they do ranking on the clean tech. There's a scoreboard for like clean technologies, and I know that they kind of also introduce this. And there are some companies working in circular economy. So, but yes, please let us know if there is something more specific around.
Exactly. I know the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is working with, of course, the C100 companies, but to my knowledge, I don't think they're really ranking them there. Maybe the World Business Council for Sustainable Development with the circular transition indicators. That's what I'm going to, of course, look at after this this session. So
if I can just quickly, I think at this point, I might even be skeptical of an authoritative ranking of businesses unless the criteria for that ranking was extremely precise, right? Unless they specified exactly, maybe it was the circularity of the product. So if I just saw a list of companies and if it was, the most circular company, I would want to make sure that there was a very detailed methodology for determining that, because there are so many different ways that a company, is it their internal operations? Is it just their output? And in what way are they being circular? Like, is it because they are using certain types of materials, or are they encouraging reuse? And then I also would wonder how the service industry was incorporated into that. How is a law firm more or less circular? That could be argued, but it's hard to compare that to a manufacturer. So I think that it is maybe an interesting path for the future as these metrics get more and more developed and data becomes more and more available. But right now, I think it's probably worth checking out these different organizations and seeing what companies have at least paid lip service or done something to objectively show that they're being more circular.
Exactly. And maybe we will see developments of rankings by different sectors, because I mean, you can compare within different sectors, of course, as opposed to trying to compare. The example someone gave in Francis in the chat says, impossible to compare a service company, as you said, with a mining company. And Phil is mentioning the repairability standards that iFixit is doing with quite a lot. With iFixit does right to repair, and they have ranked different products based on their repairability. So people have, Phil has left this in the chat in terms of repairability of products. So we might see different measurements of products in the sense of one criteria as a starting point, for example, which could also then lend into a larger assessment of circularity as well. So I see that it is heading on almost getting towards 5 o'clock in Sweden, which is our end time. And right now, I think we covered a majority of the questions in the chat. If there's a last minute question, then I would, that you're a burning question that you would really like to have directed at one of these great experts, then please, of course, this is your time. This is your time. I'll give you just a couple more seconds to type if anyone's in the middle of typing. Otherwise, we will go into some concluding remarks and also a little bit about what's next and what you can expect. What is the most important next step on this topic? Robert, would you like to just have a quick one couple line reflection on this as we head into the summary and the concluding remarks? I think that's a great way to segue as I start to share my screen.
Well, I think for us, there are a couple of things that we're really excited about working on. We are, in the last few months, we've been very focused on bridging the gap between producers and consumers, because producers aren't really going to care about measuring circularity unless they know that there are consumers on the other end that are willing to pay for it. So we've done a couple studies, as we've mentioned before. We have some preliminary evidence, some good evidence that there is a market demand for products that are labeled circular, but we want to test that in more places with a larger population, and so that we can really deliver detailed results to the people that work with us and to the world. And we're also looking into partnering with some of our colleagues at RISE that do machine learning. And we think that with more sophisticated computational power, we can actually calculate many more products a lot faster. And so we're looking at ways that we can mechanize this measurement process, and with all of the, of course, we are very aware of all the possible pitfalls and all of the challenges of doing that in a way that recognizes all the particularities of measuring circularity. But those are the things that we're very interested in right now. We're currently, if we were to offer an overview of our projects right now, we're working with furniture suppliers, we're working with public procurement, our colleagues are working with the automobile industry. And so right now we're basically testing these ideas in as many contexts as possible and trying to figure out where the things that have succeeded in our case, where are they maybe not so successful. And so we're trying to validate what we've found, and so the academic cycle will continue and continue. So that's the short, maybe not so short answer about what's next.
Can I just add something on to that? Another area that we are also looking at is connecting management systems and circularity indicators. We've been doing some work on that, as I mentioned earlier on when I introduced myself. And So we're really trying to understand if management systems, especially ISO certified standard, can actually be a means to facilitate the transition to a circular economy when certain indicators are considered. And for instance, the ones that we've developed here at RISE. So we also look at the very much how to operationalize the transition as much as possible for businesses.
Thank you, Emanuela, and of course Robert, for that last wrap up, and also Agnieszka for your great responses about the sort of consumer side, the customer side.
If I may add something.
Sure,
I
go ahead.
Because this also taps into the work on the utility and endurance metrics. We are also looking at other types of circular purchases and willingness to buy circular things. For instance, at group purchases. So basically to increase the utility of things that are underused and increase the utility of products that have great endurance, but you probably need them only once a year. So the questions we are now also trying to answer is like, would you buy something with your neighbor, for instance? So different models of sharing economy as a type of circular business model. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. I think that's quite a good overview of the projects that we're working on, and also for pressing issues, especially as Robert mentioned about the utilization aspect, for example. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of that work. In this webinar, we have talked about measuring circularity in business, and we have run the gamut of talking about different types of measurement tools and different indicators. We've had some great participation from the group chat with the different measurement tools that you are familiar with working on, but we also see from the poll that there's some overwhelming, people are feeling overwhelmed in regards to which measurement is right for me and how to apply it. So as we have seen, there's a lot of work happening in this area. And Robert introduced the C metric today as well in the presentation, which is what we have been working on at RISE in the past couple of years. So I feel it's very promising in this area that there's going to be more continued work in terms of measuring circularity in the near future because of the great organizations that are working on this. And some of you are here today. As the focus has been on metrics, and as you kind of got a taste from my colleagues, we are also driven to improve circularity of business and have expertise and regular work in partnerships with industry on other topics, including design and finance. So if you would like to collaborate in research projects with us at RISE, including by contributing to research projects from an in-kind perspective, please get in touch, and you can direct those questions to, of course, Robert. His email's on the screen today, and if he can't answer the question, he will direct you to one of the people who can. So my colleagues, Emanuela, Agnieszka, and Robert have given you an overview of kind of what we are doing in the future and the ongoing research that we are doing here at RISE. And of course, if you have questions about any of this research, you can direct your questions to Robert. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for attending today's webinar and to contributing to this discussion. We've had a really great discussion. It's difficult, of course, with virtual things, but it allows us to have a global reach and really get to know you. And I think we have had the opportunity to really engage in a conversation. I'd like to drop in the forum, in the chat box, we have an evaluation form, and we would very much appreciate it if you could fill this out and tell us how useful you found today's session, because it can allow us to contribute making informative webinars in the future. So Shortly, you will receive a recording of this webinar, as well as the evaluation form and some links that we thought might be relevant about some of the work that we've been doing regards to metrics. So thank you in advance for filling out the survey. It takes about less than 2 minutes. And thank you, of course, to my colleagues for the great contributions and discussions about our work. And thank you to you for the engaging and insightful discussions.